Good afternoon. I'm going to try to be loud and animated because I know it's got to be tough the afternoon on a Friday to be after lunch, to stay awake. So I'll try to move around and keep you awake. So anyway, thanks, Greg, for your presentation. Greg and I are trying to complement our presentation. Greg's really showing you the pieces of the technology, if you will. And what I wanted to concentrate on was translating that to a comparison and contrast to our situation and possible opportunities. So my presentation is going to follow basically identifying what I saw, the impressions I have on similarities between Kansas and Israel, and there are some. Water planning, where they're at, where we're at, what kind of lessons learned there. Water technology, some opportunities, and Greg alluded to those. And then possible next steps with emphasis maybe on policies and priorities. So starting out, if you look at this map that was done by the World Resources Institute and iSciences, it shows areas of water stress. And as you can see, the Middle East is an area that's got the dark red color. That means very stressed, and it's been that way. They've just been going through a drought. And as you look over across the Atlantic, you can see kind of our area in the southwest, similar colors, similar patterns. So we're facing the same sort of problems in terms of water stress in our parts of the world. Israel is currently experiencing an unprecedented drought, so much so that some have characterized it as being never been documented according to the Water Authority, for example. They just had a great big rain, but one rain doesn't end drought situation. And nationwide, Israel has been receiving, on average, about 64% less than what they consider to be normal rainfall. So they've been in a situation where they've been looking at drought and the consequences of drought. This is a map that's 1 year old. About this time last year, this is what the drought monitor looked like for the United States. And if you look at the real dark, ugly part of the map, that's us. And so as you saw, we were in extremely distressed or exceptionally distressed areas even just a year ago, about this time last year. So there's similarities between what Israel is going through recently and what we've been going through recently. Likewise, if you look at what's been going on recently in the context of history, there's been a significant amount of drought in the Middle East history, somewhere around 1200 to 1100 before the Common Era BCE. There was documented research that showed that it was so severe and lasted so long, drought conditions, that it actually brought down some major ancient civilizations of the time, most notably the Canaanite city-states that were there. And some say that coincides roughly with about the time of big massive changes in populations, including the migration of the Israeli people into the area of Palestine. There's also a biblical tradition of droughts. Whether you want to believe that the Bible is history or not, you can believe that the Jewish people believe that that's history. And they look at that as far as their history and see accounts of long and prolonged drought periods. And then when you look at proxy data, where information has been gathered on sediment, tree rings, those sorts of things to reconstruct weather data that isn't necessarily written, recorded weather data, it shows that there's been droughts in that part of the world that have lasted up to hundreds of years if you go back into really back in history. So Israel recognizes that they are in a current drought, but it's in the context of long history of droughts, and we've been in believe it or not, kind of a relatively wet period. These droughts are not on the same order of magnitude as the droughts that have happened in a much longer time back in history. Similarly, if you look at Kansas, this was a study that was done that also used proxy data. It was tree rings and sediment, and it reconstructed drought conditions back to, I think it was 800 AD. Yeah, 800 AD. And this on the y-axis here, that's the Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's a combination of how severe the drought is, how dry it is, and how long it lasts. And when you get down below zero, that means it's not so good, and above zero means it's better. So what you can see is these gray periods, these gray bands, those denote extraordinary, very severe droughts. Well, as you can see, you get that back around 800, 900,000 AD. There's a lot of bands there, and some of those are 75 years long. In other words, we have a history here in this part of the country, if you go back far enough in history, that you can have a severe drought on the order of the 30s drought, the Dust Bowl days, that lasts 75 years. As you can see, as you get closer into to modern times, those bands are much narrower, and so we're in a relatively wet period as well. Well, when you look at Israel, one of the other things that struck me as being similar was their country has quite a variation in rainfall and water conditions. Up north, up by the Sea of Galilee, up by Lebanon and Syria, they have much wetter conditions, and that's really where they get their water from, is that area. And where the water comes from is from a series of mountains in Syria, in Lebanon, outside of their political control. And they have the water run off in the Sea of Galilee. Now, as you go further and further south, you'll find that you get into actual desert conditions. Down in the most south part of Israel, it is desert. Similarly, when you look at Kansas, we have quite a variation in rainfall, where most of your greater rainfall is on the east and into the southeast particularly. And as you go further and further west, it gets drier and drier, and everybody in the room knows that. But it just goes to show you that there's a similar kind of a variation in rainfall between Israel, and that translates into the challenges associated with bringing water where there is to where there is not. And Israel's got that challenge, and we have that challenge. So what are you doing with all this information? You plan. And, for Israel, their planning goes way, way back. I mean, we're talking about in the 1st century BCE, Herod the Great built a series of aqueducts that took water from the areas of Mount Carmel, the areas to the east, and brought them to the city of Caesarea. And that was a big building, a big public works project, if you will. And even back at that time, when we're talking about 2,000 years ago, bringing water from where it was to where you needed it was a consideration big enough to build significant public works improvements. And that was the beginning of their regional water transport system. Back before Israel became a nation in 1948, the Zionist movement was bringing people into that area and trying to develop it. And what they were looking at was that there was a need to identify, they had identified a need to bring the water from the Jordan River to the east to the coastal area for irrigation. They've got shallow irrigation, groundwater, and some of those get drawn down very quickly. Some of them are somewhat contaminated. And so again, they're looking at